I finally bought my dream beach house after a decade of corporate burnout. On my second night there, my mother called to casually announce she and my father had sold their home and were moving in with me the very next day. When I stayed silent, she delivered the final blow. She told me that if I did not like it, I could find somewhere else to live. My hands shook, but I did not cry. I just smiled and told her I would see them at noon. Then I set a trap they would never forget. The ocean breeze off the South Carolina coast usually grounded me. I was standing on the wraparound balcony of my $1.2 million home breathing in the salt air. For the first time in my 35 years, I felt completely secure. I had spent my entire 20s and early 30s working grueling 80-hour weeks building public relations campaigns for ungrateful corporate executives. I swallowed my pride, navigated boardrooms, where I was the only Black woman, and saved every single dime I earned. When I finally walked away and launched my own boutique digital agency, the success was immediate and explosive. This house was my reward. It was a beautiful fortress of glass and weathered wood flooded with natural light representing my hard-won independence. The house was my sanctuary. I had personally chosen every detail from the imported Brazilian hardwood floors to the marble countertops in the chef kitchen. It took months of searching to find this exact property tucked away on a private stretch of coastline. After years of dealing with the noise and chaos of city living, I wanted nothing but the sound of seagulls and crashing waves. I had hired interior decorators to create a minimalist modern aesthetic that reflected my journey from a stressed-out corporate employee to a self-made business owner. Every piece of furniture, every piece of art on the walls told a story of my resilience. I had earned this peace. It was a space where my family and their toxic expectations could never reach me. Or so I thought. My phone vibrated against the glass patio table. The caller identification flashed my mother name, Valerie. I took a deep breath, bracing myself for the usual demands or passive-aggressive comments about my single status. But when I answered, there was no greeting. There was no asking how my move went, or how I was settling into my new life. Maya, we are about 2 hours outside of the state line, Valerie said, her voice carrying that sharp, commanding tone I had feared since childhood. Your father is exhausted from driving this rented truck, so you need to have the driveway clear when we get there tomorrow at noon. I froze. The wine glass in my hand suddenly felt incredibly heavy. A rented truck, I asked, my voice dropping to a dangerous quiet. Mom, what are you talking about? We sold the house in Atlanta, she stated casually, as if we were discussing the weather. We closed 2 days ago. Calvin packed up everything we are keeping. We are moving in with you. My mind raced, trying to process the absolute absurdity of her words. They had lived in that Atlanta house for 30 years. Why would you sell the house? I demanded, gripping the balcony railing so hard my knuckles ached. Valerie sighed loudly, the sound vibrating with deep irritation. Because your sister needed us, Maya. Connor Tech's startup was running out of capital. You know how important his business is. Thomas and Victoria have been putting so much pressure on them to maintain their lifestyle. Jasmine was practically in tears. Your father and I did what any loving parents would do. We gave them the equity from the house, all $800,000 of it. I closed my eyes, fighting back a wave of nausea. Jasmine. It was always Jasmine. My younger sister was the undeniable golden child of our family. While I built my business from the ground up, working until my eyes burned and my hands cramped, Jasmine was handed everything on a silver platter. Jasmine had never worked a hard day in her life. While I was taking out student loans and working nights at a diner to pay for my textbooks, Jasmine was attending a private liberal arts college fully funded by our parents. When she graduated with a useless degree, they bought her a brand new car as a reward. When I secured my first major public relations job, they simply nodded and asked if I could finally start sending money home to help out. The disparity was suffocating, but it taught me early on that I had to rely solely on myself. When Jasmine married Connor, a white man from a heavily status-obsessed old money family, my parents completely lost their minds. Connor was the ultimate prize in my parents' eyes. He came from a family that had been rich for generations. Thomas and Victoria, His parents looked down on everyone who did not belong to their exclusive yacht clubs. My father Calvin would practically break his neck bowing to Thomas at holiday gatherings, desperate for a shred of validation. My mother would spend thousands on designer dresses just to sit in Victoria living room and pretend she belonged there. They sacrificed their dignity and their retirement to maintain this illusion. Connor Tech startup was supposed to be the next big thing, but anyone with common sense could see it was a money pit. But my parents, blinded by the allure of proximity to wealth, threw their entire life savings into the fire. They desperately wanted to prove we were in the same tax bracket as Thomas and Victoria. They bankrupted themselves trying to match Thomas and Victoria over the years. They paid for a lavish destination wedding they could not afford. They bought Jasmine designer handbags, just so she would not look out of place at her country club brunches. Now they had literally rendered themselves homeless to fund Connor failing startup, just so Jasmine could keep up the facade of being a wealthy tech wife to her judgmental in-laws. And your plan was just to move into my home without asking. I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. You do not need to ask permission from your own child, Valerie snapped. We are family. We paid for your braces in middle school, Maya. We put food on your table. It is your turn to pay us back. We are taking the master suite facing the water. Your father has a bad back and needs the premium mattress. The sheer audacity of her words paralyzed me. We paid for your braces. The words echoed in my head. I remembered the exact day I got those braces. I was 12 years old, and my mother complained to the orthodontist about the cost right in front of me, making me feel like a burden. Meanwhile, that same week, she bought Jasmine a custom pageant dress that cost twice as much as my dental work. For 23 years, they had held those braces over my head, a perpetual debt I could never quite pay off. They believed that giving birth to me and providing basic necessities gave them unlimited access to my bank accounts, my time, and my property. She was equating basic parental obligations from 2 decades ago to hijacking $1 million beachfront estate. She was demanding the master suite in a home she had not contributed a single penny toward. This interaction perfectly framed my entire existence in their eyes. I was never a daughter to them. I was a safety net. I was the financial backup plan, the family scapegoat, who was expected to quietly absorb their burdens while they poured all their love and resources into Jasmine. I remembered how they skipped my college graduation because Jasmine had a minor cold and needed her mother. I remembered how they asked me to co-sign a loan for Connor's first business venture, and when I refused, they did not speak to me for 6 months. They constantly drained their own accounts for the golden child, while expecting me to foot the bill for their survival. They viewed me not as a person, but as a resource to be harvested whenever Jasmine or her husband needed a bailout. For years, I had told myself that keeping a careful distance from my family was the same thing as having boundaries. It was easier to answer the occasional phone call than to explain to relatives why I had stopped answering at all. Valerie and Calvin were experts at behaving just well enough after every blow-up to make me question whether I had overreacted. They would go quiet for a few weeks, send a birthday card, ask about a client I had mentioned months earlier, and act as if the last betrayal had never happened. Then Jasmine would need money, Connor would need an introduction, or my parents would decide some new family emergency belonged on my shoulders. I had learned to give them small pieces of access instead of the whole of me. I stopped discussing my revenue. I stopped telling them when I signed major clients. I never gave them keys to my apartments, and I kept the address of this house private until after closing. Even then, I had shared only a few photographs, because some stubborn part of me still wanted parents who could look at something I built and simply say they were proud of me. Success had not erased the old instinct to hope. I could negotiate a 7-figure campaign without blinking and still feel 12 years old when my mother sounded disappointed in me. The phone call on the balcony finally killed that hope. I did not respond immediately. The silence stretched over the phone line, thick and heavy. Valerie took my silence as submission, just as she always had. She thrived on steamrolling over my boundaries. Listen to me carefully, Maya, she continued, her tone dropping into a cold, hard threat. We gave up everything for this family. We are taking that master suite. If you do not like it, you can pack your bags and find somewhere else to live." Any other daughter might have screamed. Any other person might have broken down crying, begging for basic respect, or trying to reason with her. But a strange, terrifying calm washed over me. The insecure girl who used to cry over their conditional love had died a long time ago. The woman standing on this balcony was a chief executive officer who negotiated multi-million-dollar contracts for breakfast. I had spent years in public relations managing crises, controlling narratives, and destroying corporate bullies. Valerie had no idea who she was dealing with. I poured the rest of my wine down the sink. I needed a clear head for what was coming next. The sheer audacity of them driving a rented moving truck across state lines expecting to just take over the master suite of a house they had never even visited before was mind-boggling. But it was also the ultimate manifestation of their narcissism. They truly believed I would fold. They truly believed the quiet, obedient daughter they had conditioned me to be was still alive inside this house. They were severely mistaken. I looked out at the dark ocean, a genuine smile spreading across my face. The pieces were already clicking into place in my mind. I knew exactly how much my parents cared about public perception. I knew how desperately they wanted Thomas and Victoria to view them as wealthy equals. They wanted to move into my house and pretend it was theirs. They wanted to hide their financial ruin behind my hard work. "Okay, Mom," I said, my voice perfectly smooth and cheerful. "I will see you both tomorrow at noon. Drive safe." I ended the call before she could say another word. I did not panic. I did not run to my bedroom to pack my bags. I walked back inside my beautiful, quiet home and picked up my laptop. I had less than 24 hours to orchestrate the most important event of my career. I was going to give them exactly what they wanted. I was going to give them an audience. I was going to invite Thomas, Victoria, and every gossipy church member my parents knew to witness their grand arrival. If my parents wanted to claim my beach house, they were going to do it under the brightest spotlight I could possibly build. I walked over to the kitchen island and opened my contact list, ready to turn my private sanctuary into a public relations war zone. I tapped the name Kendra on my phone screen and listened to the dial tone echo in the quiet expanse of my kitchen. Kendra was not just my best friend since our undergraduate days at Spelman College. She was the absolute best and most sought-after luxury event planner on the entire Eastern Seaboard. We had survived the brutal trenches of corporate America together, fighting tooth and nail for every single ounce of respect we had earned in rooms that were not built for Black women like us. She knew my family dynamics intimately. She knew exactly how my parents had constantly drained my spirit to water my sister Jasmine. When Kendra answered, her voice was crisp and alert, despite the late hour of the night. "Maya, tell me you are calling to say you are drinking a ridiculously expensive bottle of red wine and watching the ocean waves," she said. "I am drinking the wine," I replied, pacing the length of my marble kitchen island. "But I need a miracle, Kendra. I need a fully catered high society housewarming and charity gala at my place. Tomorrow at noon. Champagne Towers valets a string quartet and the most intimidating floral arrangements you can source. Do whatever it takes. Double your usual rush fee. Triple it if you have to. I do not care about the cost." There was a brief pause on the line. I could practically hear the gears turning in her brilliant mind. Kendra did not ask if I was crazy. She asked the only question that mattered. Who are we destroying? "My parents," I answered, my voice completely devoid of emotion. "They just sold their house in Atlanta to fund Connor and his failing tech startup. They are arriving in a moving truck tomorrow to take over my home and claim the master suite. They expect me to quietly hand over my keys and step aside." I heard the sharp intake of breath on the other end of the line, followed by the rapid clicking of a keyboard. "Consider it done," Kendra said, her tone shifting from friendly to absolute military precision. "I have a caterer in Houston who owes me his career. He will be at your house by 9 in the morning with a full staff. I am booking a classical quartet right now. I will handle the valet permits with the local municipality. You just focus on the guest list. Wear that emerald green silk dress that makes you look like a billionaire. We are going to war." We ended the call, and I immediately dialed my second lifeline. David was my corporate attorney, a brilliant legal mind, who had protected my digital agency from predatory contracts and corporate bullies for years. He was meticulous, calculating, and fiercely loyal. More importantly, he had a flawless understanding of real estate law and civil litigation. David answered with his usual formal greeting. I cut straight to the chase, outlining my parents' sudden impending arrival, their demand to occupy my property, and their delusional belief that I owed them this house as repayment for raising me. I explained the sheer absurdity of their plan to simply drive a moving truck onto my estate and claim residency. David, I need you at my house tomorrow at 11:30 in the morning. Sharp, I told him, looking out through the floor-to-ceiling windows at the dark ocean. I need you to bring the official property deed. I need hard copies of my bank records tracing the purchase funds from my personal savings and earnings from my digital agency. And I need you to draft a formal cease and desist letter, along with written notice revoking any permission they might claim to enter or remain on my property. Bring them in the most intimidating thick leather legal folders you own. David let out a low whistle of disbelief. A family dispute, he asked, his voice laced with professional concern. The worst kind, I replied, pouring myself a glass of sparkling water. My parents operate entirely on delusion and entitlement. They will likely try to claim they have some sort of right to this property because they provided basic childcare 20 years ago. I need an ironclad legal wall standing between them and my front door. They cannot be allowed to twist the narrative this time. I will have everything printed and notarized, David assured me. I will project the deed and the bank records on the television screen if I have to. They will not get past the foyer, Maya. You have my word. I will see you tomorrow morning. I thanked him and ended the call. The defense was completely secured. Now it was time to build the offensive strategy. I sat down at my laptop and opened my design software. A party was nothing without an audience, and my parents operated entirely on public perception. Their greatest fear in life was being exposed or embarrassed in front of the wealthy circles they so desperately wanted to penetrate. They were obsessed with maintaining an illusion of grandeur, masking their financial instability with designer clothes and lies. If they wanted to claim my beach house, they were going to do it under the brightest spotlight I could possibly construct. I began drafting exclusive digital invitations for a coastal networking and charity gala. The design was elegant, sophisticated, and dripped with exclusivity, featuring gold foil accents on a navy background. I started compiling the guest list with surgical precision. First, I targeted local business owners, potential clients from Charleston, and prominent community figures. But the general crowd was just the backdrop. The real targets were much more specific. I pulled up the contact information for the most prominent gossiping members of my parents' former church in Atlanta. These were the women my mother had spent decades trying to impress. Sister Beatrice and her prayer circle, who judged everyone from the height of the church pews. I knew my parents would be absolutely mortified to have their financial ruin exposed in front of the very people they had bragged to about Jasmine marrying into wealth. I sent the digital invitations to the church elders, framing the event as a celebration of my recent business success and move to the coast. To ensure their attendance, I chartered a luxury shuttle bus to transport them from Atlanta directly to my doorstep, offering an all-expenses-paid weekend retreat. It was an irresistible offer for a group of people who thrived on free luxury and fresh gossip. I knew Sister Beatrice would have her bags packed before the email even finished loading in her inbox. The shuttle would arrive at exactly 11:45 in the morning, just 15 minutes before my parents were scheduled to pull up in their moving truck. But the final piece of the trap was the most critical. I needed Thomas and Victoria. They were Connor wealthy, status-obsessed parents. They represented old money, white privilege, and the exact type of social elitism my parents worshipped. Thomas and Victoria had always looked down on my family. They viewed Jasmine as a diverse charity case and only tolerated my parents because Jasmine had convinced them that Calvin and Valerie were independently wealthy investors. My parents had drained their life savings trying to match Thomas and Victoria wedding gifts and country club memberships, constantly bending over backwards for their approval. I knew Thomas and Victoria owned a summer home just 30 minutes up the coast from my new property. I crafted a highly personalized, glowing invitation specifically for them. I emphasized that this networking gala would feature influential regional politicians and major real estate developers. It was the exact kind of high society bait that status climbers like Thomas and Victoria could never resist. They loved rubbing elbows with the elite and showing off their perceived superiority. They would definitely show up expecting to network and drink free champagne. I hit send on the final batch of invitations and closed my laptop, feeling a deep surge of satisfaction. The stage was perfectly set. Every piece of the puzzle was locked into place. My parents thought they were rolling up to a bullied, submissive daughter who would quietly hand over the keys to her sanctuary just to keep the peace. They thought they could bully me into the shadows, so Jasmine could continue playing a wealthy socialite for her white in-laws. They believed the quiet, obedient girl they had conditioned me to be was going to silently absorb their financial ruin and give them my home. They had absolutely no idea what they were driving into. I walked upstairs to my master suite, the very room my mother had brazenly demanded over the phone. The moonlight spilled across the imported hardwood floors, illuminating the beautiful, expansive space I had worked so incredibly hard to earn. I walked over to my spacious walk-in closet and carefully laid out my stunning emerald green silk dress for the next day, pairing it with my most elegant jewelry collection. I felt a profound sense of calm settling over my entire body, pushing away the heavy decades of anxiety they had instilled in me. I turned off the lights and got into bed, pulling the soft, cool duvet over me. I listened to the rhythmic, soothing sound of the ocean waves crashing against the pristine shore outside my window. Tomorrow at noon, the delicate illusion my parents had built their entire lives upon would shatter completely. And I was going to sleep peacefully tonight, knowing I finally held the heavy iron hammer. Before I went upstairs, I spent another 20 minutes making sure the practical details were as controlled as the guest list. I changed the temporary access code on the side. Entrance checked the exterior cameras and confirmed that every door and window was secured. I was not expecting violence, but I had spent too many years in crisis communications to confuse optimism with preparation. I also emailed David copies of the closing statement, the wire confirmation from my bank, and the latest property tax record, so he would not be relying on a single document when he arrived. He replied almost immediately, telling me not to argue about ownership on the driveway and not to sign anything my parents placed in front of me. That warning seemed almost ridiculous at the time. Calvin usually relied on guilt volume and intimidation, not paperwork. Still, I saved the message. In public relations, I had learned that the worst crises were rarely caused by the first bad decision. They came from the frantic second decision people made when they realized the first one had failed. My parents were about to discover that their first decision had failed. I wanted to be ready for whatever came next. And this time I would not mistake preparation for cruelty. The morning sun breached the horizon, painting the ocean in brilliant shades of gold and deep amber. I woke up feeling more rested than I had in a decade. Today was the day. I walked downstairs to find my sanctuary completely transformed into a masterpiece of high society elegance. Kendra had outdone herself. By 9 in the morning, the caterers were already circulating through my massive chef kitchen, preparing silver trays of caviar blinis and perfectly seared scallops. The floral arrangements were breathtaking. Towering displays of white hydrangeas and cascading orchids commanded attention without overwhelming the minimalist modern aesthetic of my coastal home. The scent of fresh sea salt mixed beautifully with the expensive catering, creating an atmosphere of pure luxury. I walked back upstairs to my master suite and slipped into my emerald green silk dress. The fabric draped perfectly, giving me the exact armor I needed for the battle ahead. I paired it with a simple gold pendant and diamond stud earrings. I looked professional, wealthy, and completely unbothered. I looked like a woman who owned her life. By 11:30, the valet service had set up their professional wooden podium at the very edge of my crushed white marble driveway. The luxury sedans and sleek sports cars began to roll in precisely on schedule. The valets in their crisp black vests opened doors and handed out ticket stubs welcoming my guests to the estate. Thomas and Victoria arrived looking exactly as I expected. They wore matching cream-colored resort wear, projecting that effortless old money aura they guarded so fiercely. Victoria immediately began scanning the room, assessing the quality of the imported champagne and the caliber of the attendees. When I walked over to greet them, she offered a tight, polite smile. She was clearly surprised by the sheer scale of my success and the undeniable beauty of my property. She had always viewed my family as desperate charity cases attached to her son. Now she was standing in my million-dollar estate, sipping vintage champagne and looking slightly intimidated by my world. It was a beautiful sight to behold. On the other side of the expansive living room, Sister Beatrice and her church council had formed a tight circle near the towering seafood display. I had chartered a luxury bus to bring them directly from Atlanta, and they were treating this event like the social highlight of their decade. Beatrice was already whispering behind her manicured hand, pointing out the designer labels worn by the local politicians and business owners I had invited. They were the perfect audience for my plan. They thrived on judgment and lived for scandal. Whatever happened today would be broadcast to the entire congregation before Sunday morning service even began. They would not miss a single detail. David stood near the grand marble fireplace looking immaculate in a charcoal-tailored suit. His thick leather briefcase rested casually on the mantel, holding the legal documents that would serve as my ultimate shield against my parents. We exchanged a brief knowing nod across the room. He was ready. Kendra moved through the crowd with her digital clipboard seamlessly directing the waitstaff and adjusting the ambient lighting. She was the general, and this living room was our battlefield. Every single variable was controlled. Every single guest was a pawn in my public relations strategy. It was exactly 11:55 in the morning. The string quartet positioned near the open French doors played a flawless classical arrangement that floated over the crowd. The warm ocean breeze swept through the room carrying the scent of expensive perfume and roasted herbs. 70 guests mingled holding crystal flutes filled with golden champagne. The atmosphere was a picture of absolute unshakable perfection. I stood near the grand entryway, holding a glass of sparkling water, listening to the low hum of wealthy networking. My heart beat with a steady, calculated rhythm. I was completely in my element. Public relations is all about controlling the narrative, and I held every single string in this room. Right on cue, the elegant harmony of the string quartet was violently shattered. A loud, grinding, mechanical roar echoed from the main road outside. The sound of a heavy, struggling diesel engine cut through the sophisticated chatter, causing several guests to stop talking and turn their heads toward the massive front windows. The noise grew louder and more aggressive by the second. It sounded like a dying metal beast dragging itself across the pavement, disrupting the peaceful coastal serenity I had curated. Then it appeared. A massive 24-foot rented moving truck, covered in road grime and sporting a huge ugly dent along its right side, came crunching violently over my pristine white marble driveway. The heavy tires spat white gravel in every direction. The truck lurched forward, belching a thick cloud of dark exhaust smoke that briefly obscured the beautiful ocean view behind it. It squealed to a halting, aggressive stop right behind Victoria and her gleaming silver Mercedes-Benz. The massive rusted grille of the truck looked completely absurd parked next to the row of luxury vehicles. The entire room fell into a stunned, heavy silence. The string quartet faltered, playing a few discordant notes before trailing off completely. 70 high society guests, local politicians and gossiping church elders, stared through the floor-to-ceiling glass windows in absolute shock. The contrast was almost comical. My luxurious beachfront estate, surrounded by elegance, was now tainted by this rusted orange and white monstrosity parked aggressively on the front lawn. People began to murmur, pointing their champagne flutes at the bizarre scene unfolding outside. The heavy driver's side door of the truck groaned open with a loud metallic squeak that made a few guests wince. My father Calvin stepped out onto the driveway. He looked terrible. He was sweating profusely, wearing a faded gray shirt stained with dark patches of moving sweat and old dusty denim jeans. He stretched his back, groaning loudly, completely unaware of the massive audience watching his every move from behind the tinted glass of my home. He wiped his forehead with the back of his hand, looking like a man who had just driven straight through the night without sleeping. The passenger door swung open next. My mother Valerie hopped down onto the crushed gravel. She was wearing a chaotic, mismatched tracksuit, her hair tied up in a messy, uncombed bun. She looked exhausted and incredibly agitated. She immediately began barking orders at Calvin, waving her hands frantically and pointing toward my heavy wooden front doors. She stomped her foot on the gravel, demanding that he hurry up and get the boxes. Her voice carried faintly through the glass, sharp and full of her usual blinding entitlement. Calvin walked to the back of the rusted truck and aggressively rolled up the metal cargo door. The rattling sound echoed like a gunshot across the quiet property, causing Victoria to take a step back from the window. Calvin reached inside the dark cavern of the truck and pulled out two cheap, flimsy cardboard boxes taped together with peeling duct tape. Valerie stomped over and grabbed one of the boxes, struggling slightly under its shifting weight. She balanced it on her hip, adjusting her grip with a loud huff of annoyance. They turned around to face the house, ready to march up my front steps and claim their new stolen kingdom. That was the exact moment they realized they were not alone. Valerie froze mid-step, her feet planted firmly in the gravel as her eyes widened to an unnatural size. She took in the scene before her with slow, dawning horror. She saw the professional valet podium stationed at the edge of the driveway. She saw the young men in black vests staring at her in confusion. She saw the row of pristine luxury cars parked neatly along the manicured lawn. And then she looked up at the massive glass windows of the house. Through the massive open glass doors, she saw the caterers in their crisp white uniforms holding silver trays. She saw the string quartet clutching their cellos and violins. She saw 70 impeccably dressed guests staring back at her in sheer bewilderment. And most importantly, she saw Sister Beatrice pressing her face against the glass, her eyes wide with shock, recognizing her former church friend standing in the driveway, looking like a disheveled vagrant hauling cheap cardboard boxes. The color completely drained from Valerie and her face. The arrogant, entitled woman who had threatened me on the phone the night before evaporated into thin air. Calvin stood frozen beside her, the heavy cardboard box slipping slightly in his sweaty grip. His mouth hung slightly open. They looked like two intruders who had accidentally wandered onto a high-budget movie set. They were completely paralyzed by the sheer magnitude of the situation they had just walked into. They had expected an empty house. They had expected a quiet, bullied daughter who would silently take their luggage, bow her head, and hand over the master bedroom keys without a fight. They had expected to hide their massive financial ruin behind closed doors and pretend to the world that they had moved to the coast for a luxurious, peaceful retirement. They wanted to use my success to mask their ultimate failure. Instead, they were standing in the middle of a high society charity gala, covered in road sweat, hauling cheap taped-up boxes, while the wealthiest people they knew watched them in stunned, absolute silence. The gossips from their church were already pulling out their phones. Thomas and Victoria were looking at them with undisguised, wealthy disgust. Every single lie my parents had ever told was unraveling right there on the white gravel. I took a slow, deliberate sip of my sparkling water. The cool liquid felt incredibly refreshing against my throat. I smoothed the fabric of my emerald silk dress, squared my shoulders, and smiled. It was a genuine, radiant smile. The kind of smile you only get when you finally realize you hold all the absolute power. I handed my glass to a passing waiter and walked confidently toward the open front doors, ready to deliver the welcome they so desperately deserved. I stepped through the massive glass doors onto the sweeping front deck. The warm ocean breeze caught the edge of my emerald green silk dress, but my posture remained perfectly rigid. From my vantage point on the elevated deck, I had an unobstructed view of the psychological short circuit happening in my mother brain. For exactly 10 seconds, Valerie was completely paralyzed. The heavy, cheap cardboard box she was balancing on her hip began to slip. Her eyes darted wildly from the polished valets to the luxury cars, to the towering floral arrangements visible through the glass. I watched the terror of public humiliation wash over her. She realized that Sister Beatrice and the entire church gossip committee were staring directly at her mismatched tracksuit and uncombed hair. But narcissism is a powerful survival mechanism. I watched my mother do what she had done my entire life. I watched her twist reality to protect her fragile ego. Valerie abruptly dropped the taped-up cardboard box onto the crushed white marble driveway. The box hit the ground with a dull thud, and one of the corners split open, spilling a tangled mess of old extension cords and cheap plastic kitchenware onto the pristine gravel. She did not even look down. Instead, she aggressively smoothed the front of her chaotic tracksuit and patted down her messy hair bun. She squared her shoulders, took a deep breath, and pasted on the most terrifyingly fake smile I had ever seen. Calvin stood behind her, wiping sweat from his forehead with the back of his hand, looking completely bewildered. Valerie turned to him and hissed something under her breath. I could not hear the words, but I knew the tone. It was the same tone she used when she forced me to lie to my teachers about why I could not afford school field trips. She was commanding him to play along. Calvin stiffened his face, draining of color, but he nodded obediently. My mother turned her attention back to the house and began marching up the wide wooden steps of the deck. She walked with an exaggerated confidence that completely contradicted her disheveled appearance. Every step she took was a masterclass in delusion. The 70 high society guests behind me had gone completely silent. The only sound was the rhythmic crashing of the ocean waves and the sharp click of my mother's shoes hitting the wooden planks. As she reached the top of the stairs, Valerie laid eyes on Thomas and Victoria. Connor wealthy status-obsessed parents were standing near the champagne tower, holding their crystal flutes and staring at my parents with thinly veiled disgust. Victoria's eyes raked over my mother's tracksuit and the sweat stains on my father's shirt. This was my parents' absolute worst nightmare. They had bankrupted themselves, they had sold their home of 30 years just to impress these specific white people. And now they were standing in front of them, looking like they had just crawled out of a dumpster. But Valerie refused to break character. She walked straight into the center of my living room, ignoring me completely. She threw her arms open wide as if she were embracing the entire crowd. Her voice rang out sharp and desperately cheerful, cutting through the thick silence of the room. "Welcome, everyone," she announced, her voice echoing off the high vaulted ceilings. "Welcome to our new beach house." A collective gasp rippled through the crowd. Sister Beatrice nearly dropped her plate of caviar blinis. Thomas and Victoria exchanged a bewildered look. David, my attorney, narrowed his eyes from his position near the fireplace. Kendra stood near the catering station, her jaw practically hitting the floor. Valerie did not stop there. She spun around, placing a hand over her heart, and looked directly at Thomas and Victoria. "Oh, it is just so wonderful to see you all here," she continued, projecting her voice so every single person in the room could hear her lies. "Calvin and I are just so overwhelmed. We decided it was finally time to retire to the coast and enjoy the fruits of our labor. And our sweet Maya here," she gestured vaguely in my direction, without actually looking at me. "Our daughter is so sweet to throw us this beautiful retirement party. What a wonderful surprise." The sheer audacity of her statement hung in the air like toxic smoke. She was trying to claim my $1 million estate as her retirement home. She was trying to frame this exclusive high society networking gala as a party thrown in her honor. She honestly believed that if she said it loudly enough in front of all these important people, I would just lower my head and play along. She thought the old Maya, the scared little girl who desperately craved her mother love, would step forward and confirm her delusional narrative just to save the family from public embarrassment. Calvin managed to force a stiff, awkward chuckle, stepping up beside my mother. "Yes," he boomed, wiping his sweaty palms on his dusty jeans. "We are so blessed. It has been a long drive from Atlanta, but coming home to this beautiful house makes it all worth it." He reached out to put his arm around my mother's shoulder, projecting the image of a successful, wealthy couple settling into their luxurious new life. They stood in the center of my pristine home, surrounded by my success, trying to steal it piece by piece with their words. 10 years ago, I would have frozen. 10 years ago, I would have felt the familiar suffocating weight of anxiety crushing my chest. I would have nodded sheepishly, forced a smile, and let them take everything from me just to keep the peace. I would have let them shrink me down so they could look taller. But I was not that girl anymore. I was a self-made woman who had clawed her way to the top of a ruthless industry. I had built an empire from the ground up while they threw their money into a bottomless pit to support Jasmine and her husband. I had bled for this house. I had sacrificed sleep, relationships, and my own sanity to secure this exact patch of oceanfront property. There was absolutely no way on this earth I was going to let them steal my crown. I walked slowly toward the center of the room. The crowd parted for me intuitively, sensing the massive shift in the atmosphere. The emerald silk of my dress caught the natural light from the windows, making me look like a force of nature. I did not look angry. I did not look hurt. I looked completely and utterly in control. I stopped right next to the string quartet. A sleek silver microphone on a stand had been set up for my welcoming speech to my clients and guests. I reached out and gently pulled the microphone from its cradle. The soft electronic hum of the speakers indicated that the sound system was live. Every single eye in the room was locked on me. Sister Beatrice leaned forward in her chair, completely mesmerized by the unfolding drama. Victoria gripped her champagne flute tightly, her eyes darting between me and my mother. Valerie looked at me, her fake smile straining at the edges. Her eyes delivered a silent, desperate threat. She was silently demanding that I confirm her story. She was daring me to embarrass her in front of Connor parents. I held the microphone up to my lips. My voice echoed through the massive living room, perfectly clear, perfectly calm, and devastatingly sharp. "Actually, Mom," I said, holding her gaze without blinking. "I invited everyone here today to celebrate my new property." I paused, letting the words hang in the silent room. I watched the blood slowly drain from my mother's face. I watched Calvin's posture instantly stiffen, his false joviality evaporating in a millisecond. This house was paid for entirely with my own savings and earnings from my digital agency. I continued, my voice echoing off the glass and wood. "It is not your retirement home. And this is certainly not a retirement party. It is a celebration of my independence." The silence that followed was absolute. It was the kind of heavy, suffocating silence that sucks the oxygen out of a room. No one moved. No one spoke. The clinking of glasses and the soft shuffle of expensive shoes ceased completely. My words had sliced through my mother's carefully constructed illusion like a scalpel. I watched the realization hit Thomas and Victoria. I watched them process the fact that Calvin and Valerie had just arrived in a dirty moving truck, wearing sweat-stained clothes, trying to falsely claim ownership of their daughter, multi-million-dollar estate. The disgust on Victoria's face was palpable. She physically took a step away from my parents, as if their financial desperation were contagious. Sister Beatrice let out a loud, dramatic gasp, covering her mouth with both hands. The church elders immediately began whispering fiercely to one another, their eyes wide with scandalous delight. The narrative my parents had spun in Atlanta about their immense wealth and successful investments was burning to the ground right in front of their congregation. Valerie's mouth opened, but no sound came out. She was completely paralyzed by the public rejection. Her entire world was built on the foundation of my compliance, and I had just shattered that foundation into a million irreparable pieces. She looked at me with a mixture of profound shock and rising aggressive panic. She realized in that exact moment that she had lost all control over me. I watched Calvin's chest begin to heave with rapid, uneven breaths. The humiliation was tearing him apart from the inside out. He had always prided himself on being the patriarch, the man who commanded respect through intimidation. But standing in my living room, surrounded by wealth he could never achieve, he looked incredibly small. He looked like a man who had gambled his entire life on a losing hand. The murmurs in the crowd began to swell, growing from soft whispers into a low, undeniable buzz of judgment. The local business owners I had invited exchanged knowing glances, recognizing the harsh reality of a family trying to exploit a successful relative. My best friend Kendra stood by the catering tables, a fierce, proud smile playing on her lips. She knew exactly what it cost me to speak those words, and she knew exactly what was coming next. Valerie's hands began to tremble. The fake smile had completely vanished, replaced by a twisted mask of humiliated fury. She had played her hand, assuming I would cower in the shadow of high society expectations. She never anticipated that I would use those exact same expectations to trap her in her own lies. I lowered the microphone, keeping my eyes locked on her, waiting for her next move. The trap had been sprung, and there was absolutely nowhere left for them to hide. I stood perfectly still, letting the absolute reality of my words sink into my mother brain. Valerie looked like a woman who had just stepped off a cliff and was waiting for the ground to rush up and meet her. Her mouth worked soundlessly. The thick layer of foundation on her face suddenly looked like a cracking porcelain mask. Behind me, the soft chatter of my 70 high society guests had completely evaporated. You could hear a pin drop in that massive living room. The only sound was the rhythmic crashing of the Atlantic waves outside my floor-to-ceiling windows and the frantic, heavy breathing of my father. I did not break eye contact with Valerie. I wanted her to feel the full crushing weight of her public exposure. I wanted her to know that the submissive scapegoat she had bullied for 35 years was dead and buried. I slightly turned my head toward the catering station and caught Kendra's eye. My best friend gave me a single sharp nod. She tapped the screen of her digital clipboard. Instantly, the massive 85-inch smart television mounted above my marble fireplace flashed to life. It had been displaying a rotating gallery of coastal art, but now the screen went stark white. A high-resolution scan of a legal document appeared projected in massive, undeniable proportions for every single person in the room to read. It was the official property deed to the estate. Kendra zoomed in on the center of the document. My full legal name, Maya Lauren Brooks, appeared on the deed as the sole grantee of the property. Kendra then brought up the closing statement and supporting bank records showing the $1.2 million purchase price and tracing the funds directly to my personal savings and documented earnings from my digital agency. No CO borrower or outside financing had been involved. I watched as the eyes of the entire room shifted from me to the massive television screen. Sister Beatrice physically leaned forward, adjusting her reading glasses to verify the numbers. I could hear the church elders gasping, whispering feverishly to one another as they processed the undeniable proof of my wealth. They were realizing that Valerie had been spinning a web of absolute lies about her own financial status, while completely ignoring her eldest daughter's actual monumental success. I lowered the microphone, keeping it gripped firmly in my right hand. With my left hand, I reached over to the small crystal table next to me and picked up a thick, beautifully embossed navy blue leather folder. I walked slowly toward my mother. Every step I took across the imported hardwood floor felt like a victory march. Valerie's eyes tracked my movement, her body completely rigid with terror. When I closed the distance between us, I held out the heavy leather folder. She did not reach for it. Her hands remained frozen at her sides, clenching the fabric of her mismatched tracksuit. I pushed the folder directly against her chest, forcing her to bring her hands up to catch it before it fell. "Go ahead, Mom," I said, my voice dropping to a conversational volume that only she, my father, and the front row of guests could hear. "Open it. Consider it your official welcome gift." Valerie's fingers trembled violently as she flipped open the heavy leather cover. Inside, resting on crisp white legal paper, were two distinct documents drafted perfectly by David. I watched her eyes dart back and forth across the legal jargon. The first document was a formal cease and desist letter, demanding that she stop falsely claiming ownership of my assets. The second was written notice formally revoking any permission Valerie or Calvin might claim to enter or remain on the property, and warning that any refusal to leave could be reported to local law enforcement. Valerie's face contorted in a mix of profound confusion and rising panic. She looked up at me, her eyes silently begging me to stop the humiliation. This was a woman who had spent her entire adult life curating an image of superiority and grace. Now she was standing in front of Thomas and Victoria, holding a legal document that explicitly labeled her as an unwanted trespasser in her own daughter's home. She opened her mouth to speak, to try and spin some sort of excuse or desperate lie, but her vocal cords simply refused to cooperate. She was drowning in her own exposed reality. That was when my father snapped. Calvin had always been a man who masked his own deep insecurities with aggressive, explosive outbursts. He could not handle the intellectual or financial superiority of women, especially not the daughter he had spent decades treating like a second-class citizen. He saw his wife crumbling. He saw the wealthy white people he worshipped staring at him with undisguised contempt. The sheer pressure of the public humiliation triggered his fight-or-flight response, and he chose to fight. Calvin lunged forward, closing the 2 feet of space between us in a single aggressive stride. His large, calloused hand shot out and gripped my upper arm with a bruising, terrifying force. His fingers dug deeply into my bare skin, right below the shoulder strap of my emerald silk dress. I felt a sharp flare of physical pain, but I did not flinch. I did not pull away. I stood my ground staring directly into his bloodshot, furious eyes. His face was inches from mine, radiating heat and the smell of stale coffee and road sweat. For one sharp second, the room disappeared, and I was 16 again, standing in our old Atlanta kitchen while Calvin towered over me because I had challenged the way he spoke to me. He had never needed to hit me to make his size part of the argument. A doorway blocked with his body, a voice lowered until everyone else went silent, or a hand gripping the back of a chair had always been enough. My body remembered that language before my mind could reject it. The pain in my arm brought me back to the present. I felt the pressure of his fingers, the microphone in my hand, the floor steady beneath my heels, and dozens of witnesses only a few feet away. The difference was not that I had suddenly become fearless. The difference was that fear no longer made decisions for me. I glanced down once and saw red marks already forming beneath his fingers. Whatever private family argument Valerie might later invent, this was no longer private. Calvin had crossed a physical boundary in front of my attorney, my closest friend, his church acquaintances, and a room full of people with no reason to protect his version of events. I pulled free because I finally understood that I did not have to stand there and absorb whatever he decided to do. For the first time, I was not trying to survive my father. I was refusing him access. For once, I believed my own right to leave. "You have always been the selfish, ugly duckling of this family." Calvin hissed, his voice a venomous, trembling whisper meant only for my ears. His breath was ragged, his jaw clenched so tight I could see the muscles jumping in his cheeks. "How dare you do this to us? Do not embarrass us in front of these white folks, Maya. You fix this right now. Tell them it is a joke." The words ugly duckling were supposed to break me. It was the exact phrase he used to use when I was a teenager crying in my room because he refused to pay for my prom dress while simultaneously buying Jasmine a designer gown for a random Tuesday night dinner. It was his ultimate weapon of control, designed to instantly reduce me to a small, insecure girl desperate for her father validation. He honestly thought invoking that childhood trauma would snap me back into compliance. I thought his physical intimidation combined with his desperate need to impress Connor's wealthy parents would force me to surrender my dignity. Calvin's free hand aggressively reached out toward my right hand, trying to violently snatch the silver microphone from my grip. He intended to hijack the sound system. He was going to force a booming fake laugh and tell the 70 guests that his brilliant, funny daughter was just playing a hilarious prank on her old parents to celebrate their arrival. He was going to steal my voice and rewrite the narrative right in front of my face to save his own fragile ego. But I held on. My fingers locked around the metal base of the microphone with an iron grip. I had spent 10 years navigating boardrooms full of aggressive, entitled corporate men trying to silence me. I had built a company from the ground up by refusing to let anyone snatch my power. My father's physical intimidation meant absolutely nothing to me anymore. I tightened my stance, my heels planted firmly on the hardwood floor, and yanked my arm forcefully out of his bruising grip. The sudden release of tension caused Calvin to stumble forward slightly, throwing him off balance. I took a deliberate step back, creating a clear, visible boundary between us. I raised the microphone back to my lips, ensuring that every single person in the room could hear the absolute authority in my voice. The guests who had seen the brief physical struggle were now on high alert. The string quartet remained frozen in place. Sister Beatrice had actually stood up from her chair, her eyes wide with shock at seeing Calvin physically grab me. The polished veneer of their respected church deacon was completely shattered, exposing the aggressive, desperate man underneath. "There is no joke to be made here, Calvin," I said, intentionally using his first name instead of calling him Dad. I let the rejection echo through the room. "I handed you those documents because you and Valerie drove a moving truck onto my private estate, under the delusion that you could simply steal the life I built. You bankrupted yourselves for a facade, and now you expect me to pay the tab. That ends today. You have exactly 5 minutes to get back into that rusted truck and drive away from my property before my attorney calls local law enforcement to remove you for trespassing." I watched the raw, undisguised panic flood my father's eyes. He looked around the room, desperately searching for an ally, searching for someone who would validate his patriarchal authority. He looked toward Thomas and Victoria, hoping they would step in and defend the concept of family loyalty. He wanted Connor's wealthy father to nod in agreement and shame me for disrespecting my elders. But Thomas simply stared back at him with cold, unyielding, wealthy indifference. Victoria actually raised her chin, looking down her nose at Calvin, as if he were a completely foreign species. The dynamic had completely shifted. Calvin and Valerie were isolated, trapped in a prison of their own making. I stood tall, my emerald dress flowing around me, the undisputed master of my own domain. The documents were in their hands. The truth was projected in bright yellow ink on the massive screen behind me. The microphone was securely in my grip. I had systematically dismantled their power, their pride, and their public image in mere minutes. But the destruction of their golden facade was not quite finished yet, because the true architect of their financial ruin had not yet entered the room. The heavy, suffocating silence in my living room was absolute. My father Calvin stood completely frozen, his large, calloused hands hanging uselessly at his sides. He had just looked toward Thomas and Victoria, hoping to find some kind of patriarchal solidarity in Connor's wealthy parents. He desperately wanted Thomas to step forward to validate his authority and help him put his disobedient daughter back in her place. He wanted the comfort of another man confirming that children should submit to their parents regardless of the circumstances. Instead, he was met with a wall of glacial, wealthy indifference. It was the specific type of coldness that old money reserves entirely for those they deem socially and financially beneath them. Thomas did not even blink. He simply took a slow, deliberate sip of his champagne, his face a mask of complete detachment. He looked at my father not as a peer, but as a fascinating, highly unpleasant spectacle. The rejection was profound and immediate. I watched the last remaining shreds of Calvin-inflated ego drain right out of his body. He opened his mouth to stammer out some kind of excuse, a desperate attempt to patch the massive holes in his sinking ship, but his voice completely failed him. The reality of his situation had finally paralyzed his vocal cords. Before Calvin could seize control of the narrative or force another lie into the open air, Victoria decided she had seen enough. Connor's mother was a woman who navigated high society with the ruthless precision of a shark. She did not tolerate public embarrassment, and she certainly did not tolerate being lied to by people she considered her social inferiors. Victoria handed her crystal champagne flute to a passing waiter without even looking at him. She smoothed the front of her pristine cream-colored linen blazer and took a deliberate step forward. The crowd of 70 high society guests instantly parted for her. It was a fascinating display of social hierarchy. The local politicians, the business owners, and even the gossiping elders from my parents' former church instinctively stepped back to give Victoria an unobstructed path. She moved with a terrifying slow grace. Every single click of her expensive designer heels on my imported hardwood floors sounded like a judge banging a gavel. She did not look at me. She did not look at the massive television screen projecting the deed to my home. Her sharp, piercing gaze was locked entirely on Calvin and Valerie. Valerie's posture instantly crumbled. My mother, who had spent her entire adult life terrorizing me and demanding submission from everyone around her, physically shrank under Victoria's approaching gaze. She instinctively tried to hide her sweat-stained, mismatched tracksuit by crossing her arms over her chest. It was a pathetic, futile gesture. There was absolutely nowhere to hide the dust, the grime, or the overwhelming stench of desperation they had dragged into my pristine home. Victoria came to a halt exactly 3 feet away from my parents. She looked them up and down slowly, letting her eyes linger on the cheap, peeling duct tape of the cardboard box they had abandoned on the white gravel outside. When she finally spoke, her voice was not loud, but it carried a sharp, commanding resonance that easily cut through the quiet room. "What exactly is going on here?" Victoria asked, her tone dripping with sheer, unfiltered disgust. My mother let out a small, terrified squeak. She sounded like a cornered animal. "Victoria," she stammered, her hands shaking violently. "Victoria, please, you have to understand. This is just a massive misunderstanding. She is just confused. We are having a private family disagreement." "A private family disagreement." Victoria repeated, her voice dropping to an icy, terrifying whisper. You drove a rusted commercial moving truck onto this beautiful estate, wearing filthy clothes, and attempted to physically intimidate your daughter into surrendering her property. You did this in front of my husband and my social peers. You have humiliated yourselves, and by association, you have embarrassed my family. Calvin tried to step in front of my mother, his face a deep shade of crimson. Now listen here, Victoria, he started, puffing out his chest in a weak attempt to reclaim his masculinity. We are Jasmine parents. We are your family now. You need to show some respect. Victoria did not even flinch. She simply raised her chin, looking down her nose at Calvin, as if he were a particularly repulsive insect that had crawled onto her designer shoe. You are not my family, Calvin, she stated flatly, stripping away the delusion my parents had clung to for years. You are the parents of my daughter-in-law. And right now I am beginning to question every single thing your daughter has ever told us about your background. The air in the room grew incredibly thin. Sister Beatrice, who was standing just a few feet away, clutched her pearl necklace, her eyes wide with scandalous delight. She was witnessing the total systematic destruction of Valerie's social standing, and she was soaking up every single second of it. Victoria took another step forward, closing the distance. She pointed a perfectly manicured finger directly at my mother's chest. Let us get something straight right now, Valerie. Maya just announced that you bankrupt yourselves. She just stated publicly that you sold your primary residence to fund my son failing technology startup. Is that true? Valerie's eyes darted frantically around the room, looking for an escape route that did not exist. I could see the sweat beading on her forehead, mixing with her heavy foundation. Victoria, we just wanted to help Connor, she pleaded, her voice cracking. We wanted to support their dreams. We knew they were struggling with the business capital, so we made a sacrifice. We are good parents. We just wanted to be supportive. Victoria's face contorted into a mask of pure, unadulterated fury. Her composed society demeanor cracked, exposing a fierce, terrifying anger. Support their dreams, she asked, her voice rising in volume. She looked at Calvin and Valerie in sheer disgust and asked loudly, Wait, you sold your house. You actually sold your only home. The entire room gasped collectively. The reality of the situation was finally hitting the crowd. They were not just watching a family argument, they were witnessing a spectacular financial suicide. Jasmine and Connor told us they bought a $2 million estate. Using Jasmine's massive tech salary, Victoria continued, projecting her voice so every single guest and church member could hear the profound depth of the deception. They told us Jasmine had secured a massive executive position at a Silicon Valley firm. They told us she was independently wealthy and fully funding the startup with her own impressive corporate bonuses. They bragged about their new luxury property just last week at our country club dinner. I watched my parents' faces completely drain of color. The blood rushed out of Valerie's cheeks, leaving her looking gray and incredibly sick. Calvin staggered back half a step, as if Victoria had physically struck him. The house of cards they had built alongside my sister was currently collapsing in spectacular fashion. Jasmine had lied. Of course she had lied. My golden sister had always been a master manipulator. She had taken the $800,000 my parents gave her from the sale of our childhood home and completely fabricated a narrative of her own independent success. She had looked her wealthy in-laws dead in the eye and told them she was a high-powered tech executive funding her husband's dreams. She had routed a large portion of my parents' money into Connor's failing startup and burned through the rest, maintaining their fake rich lifestyle with designer clothes, luxury cars, and constant displays of wealth, all while letting Thomas and Victoria believe she was a corporate prodigy. And the most pathetic part was that my parents had no idea. They had willingly made themselves homeless, completely unaware that Jasmine was erasing their sacrifice from the narrative to make herself look better. They had given up their 30-year home, their comfort, and their dignity just so Jasmine could pretend she was a self-made millionaire. Victoria took a deep breath, her chest heaving with indignation. If Jasmine is supposedly a self-made millionaire purchasing $2 million estates, Victoria demanded, her voice echoing through the silent room. Then why on earth are you standing in this woman's living room covered in road dirt trying to steal her home? Why are you trying to steal Maya home when your precious golden daughter supposedly has a mansion waiting for you? The question hung in the air, a heavy, suffocating truth that demanded an answer. Valerie's legs gave out slightly, and she had to lean heavily against Calvin to keep from collapsing onto my imported hardwood floor. She was hyperventilating, her eyes darting wildly between Victoria, the massive television screen displaying my property deed, and the horrified faces of her former church members. She had absolutely nothing to say. There was no lie big enough to cover the massive crater that had just been blasted into her reality. She had sacrificed her entire existence for a daughter who was currently parading around wealthy circles pretending her parents' money was her own hard-earned salary. She had driven across state lines to bully me out of my safe haven because her favorite child had left her completely destitute and homeless. I stood quietly near the microphone watching the absolute devastation unfold. I did not feel a single ounce of pity. I had spent my entire life being called the selfish, ugly duckling. I had spent 35 years being told I was not ambitious enough, not graceful enough, and not worthy of their investment. Now I was standing in my million-dollar sanctuary watching the people who broke me get completely crushed by the very societal standards they worshipped. Sister Beatrice leaned over to another church elder and whispered something that was definitely not a prayer. The local politicians were shaking their heads in quiet disbelief. David, my attorney, stood by the fireplace looking incredibly satisfied with the airtight legal trap we had laid. Victoria glared at my parents for one final long moment, her expression conveying a level of disdain I had never seen before. "You are pathetic," she stated, her voice dropping back to a lethal, icy whisper. "You are absolute frauds, both of you." She turned her back on them, dismissing them completely from her reality. As she walked back toward her husband, the heavy silence in the room was suddenly broken by the sound of approaching voices from the front deck. The final act of this incredible disaster was arriving right on schedule. I looked past my devastated parents through the massive open glass doors and saw two very familiar figures walking up the wooden steps, completely oblivious to the massacre that had just taken place inside. Jasmine was laughing loudly. The bright, carefree sound carried over the warm ocean breeze, completely tone-deaf to the absolute destruction waiting for her inside my home. She walked through the massive glass doors arm in arm with her husband Connor, looking like they had just stepped out of a high-fashion magazine spread. My younger sister was draped in a tailored cream Chanel suit that I knew cost more than my first car. Connor wore a casual but distinctly expensive linen blazer, his wrist heavy with a gleaming silver Rolex. They strolled into my living room, projecting the exact image of young, unbothered generational wealth. It was an incredibly expensive costume paid for entirely by the 30 years of equity my parents had built in their Atlanta home. They paused just inside the threshold. The radiant, confident smile on Jasmine's face slowly began to falter as she finally registered the dead, heavy silence of the room. She expected to walk into a lively, high-society party where she would instantly become the center of attention. She expected to gracefully accept compliments from the church elders and exchange smug, knowing glances with her wealthy in-laws. Instead, she walked into a room where 70 people were staring at her with undisguised, morbid fascination. Then Jasmine saw our parents. Calvin and Valerie were still standing in the center of the living room, sweating, trembling, and looking like they had just survived a shipwreck. Valerie's mismatched tracksuit was covered in road dust. Calvin's face was a frightening shade of purple. Jasmine's eyes darted from our disheveled parents to the massive television screen projecting the legal deed to my home, then to the crystal-clear disgust radiating from Connor's parents. Mom, Jasmine whispered, stepping away from Connor slightly. "What is going on? Why are you dressed like that? Where are the movers?" Before my mother could even attempt to string together a coherent sentence, Victoria moved. Connor's mother descended upon her son and daughter-in-law with the swift, merciless precision of a hawk. Thomas flanked her, his jaw set so tightly I thought his teeth might shatter. Connor Thomas barked, his voice cracking like a whip across the silent room. "What is the meaning of this? Your wife told us her parents were wealthy real estate investors. She told us they were touring coastal properties today. So why are they standing in this woman house covered in dirt looking like vagrants?" Connor blinked rapidly, completely caught off guard by his father's aggressive tone. "Dad, I do not understand, he stammered, looking at Jasmine for help. Jasmine said they were downsizing their investment portfolio. She said they wanted a smaller beach house. Victoria let out a sharp, humorless laugh that made Jasmine physically flinch. Downsizing. Victoria practically spat the word. These people just arrived in a rented commercial moving truck. They tried to physically intimidate Maya into giving them her house because they are completely broke, Connor. They sold their only home. Jasmine's face lost all its rich brown color, turning ashen. Her flawless makeup suddenly looked like a tragic mask painted over pure panic. Victoria, she stepped forward, raising her hands in a placating gesture. Victoria, please let me explain. Maya is just causing drama. She is always jealous of me. My parents just wanted to surprise her. I had listened to my sister play the victim for my entire life. I had watched her bat her eyelashes and weaponize her tears to escape every single consequence of her actions. She had built her entire existence on my back, using my parents' blind favoritism as a shield. She thought she could just utter the word jealous, and the entire room would side with her. But today my shield was a live microphone and 70 highly influential witnesses. I brought the microphone back to my lips. My voice cut through the air, smooth, authoritative, and completely devoid of mercy. There is no jealousy here, Jasmine, I stated clearly, ensuring the sound system carried my words to every corner of the estate. And there is certainly no surprise. You are standing in my home wearing clothes bought with the blood and sweat of our parents' retirement. Jasmine whipped her head toward me, her eyes wide with terror. Maya, shut up, she hissed, dropping the sweet, innocent act instantly. Shut your mouth right now. I took a slow step forward, dominating the space. Let us be completely honest with Thomas and Victoria. I continued addressing her wealthy in-laws directly. Your daughter-in-law is not a high-powered tech executive. She does not have a massive corporate salary or independent wealth. She has never held a job that paid more than minimum wage. The $2 million estate she bragged about purchasing last week does not exist. It is a complete fabrication designed to make you think she belongs in your social circle. The church elders from Atlanta gasped in unison. Sister Beatrice was clutching her chest, fanning herself with a cocktail napkin. The local politicians exchanged shocked glances. Thomas turned to his son, his face rigid with fury. Is this true? Connor, Thomas demanded. Did you lie to us about her background? Connor was sweating now, tugging nervously at the collar of his expensive linen blazer. Dad, I swear I thought she had the money, he pleaded, his voice pitching up in panic. She handled all the personal finances. She told me her investments paid out. I did not let Connor escape the fire. I kept my eyes locked on my sister, watching her perfectly curated life burn to the ground. She did not have investments, Connor, I announced into the microphone. She had Calvin and Valerie. My parents sold their home of 30 years to fund your failing startup. They liquidated their entire existence and gave Jasmine $800,000 in cash, so you could pretend your business was successful, and she could pretend she was a self-made millionaire. I pointed a perfectly manicured finger at my trembling parents. They drove here today to hijack my home because they literally have nowhere else to live. They made themselves homeless to buy your love, Victoria. They wanted to sit at your country club tables so badly they threw their own survival into the incinerator. The truth hit the room with the destructive force of a hurricane. The absolute depravity of the situation settled over the high society guests. They were looking at Calvin and Valerie not just as frauds, but as deeply pathetic, tragic figures who had ruined their own lives for the sake of social climbing. Valerie let out a loud, wretched sob, burying her face in her hands. The tough, aggressive woman who had threatened to kick me out of my own house less than 24 hours ago was completely broken. Calvin stared at the floor, his shoulders slumped, his breathing shallow and rapid. He could not look at Thomas. The man he had spent years trying to impress now viewed him with absolute, unadulterated pity. Connor was backing away from Jasmine, as if she had suddenly caught fire. The golden boy of the country club, set the man my parents had bankrupted themselves to impress, was completely unraveling under the crushing weight of his parents' severe judgment. He looked at his father, Thomas, and began to aggressively shake his head, his hands raised in a gesture of absolute frantic surrender. How was a coward, retreating to the safety of his generational wealth and he was perfectly willing to leave my sister to burn in the wreckage of her own lies. I swear to you, Dad, I did not know. Connor pleaded, his voice cracking under the intense scrutiny of the silent room. He pointed a trembling finger directly at his wife. She handled all the accounting for the startup. She set up the holding companies and the business accounts. She told me the initial seed capital came from her stock options and some early corporate investments she made before we got married. I had no idea her parents sold their house. I had no idea they were broke. Jasmine stood completely frozen, her mouth hanging open in sheer disbelief. She reached out a hand toward him, her designer-heavy wrist trembling. "Connor," she whispered, stepping toward him. "How can you say that to them?" We sat at this kitchen table together when the wire transfer from my parents cleared. You knew exactly where that money came from. Connor forcefully slapped her hand away, his face contorting into a mask of pure defensive disgust. "Do not touch me, and do not try to drag me into your ghetto family drama, Jasmine," he shouted, his voice echoing off the high vaulted ceilings of my living room. "You lied to me from the very beginning. You told me your parents were silent partners downsizing their massive investment portfolio. You never once told me they sold their primary residence and left themselves homeless to fund my company. You told me your family was rich. You made me look like a fool in front of my own parents." Victoria let out a sound of pure revulsion. Connor's mother looked at Jasmine like she was a diseased animal that had crawled out of the sewer and onto her pristine white carpets. "You absolute fraud," Victoria spat the words, hitting my sister like physical blows. "You manipulated my son. You infiltrated our family with stolen money and fabricated prestige. You are nothing but a common scam artist." The reality of her shattered marriage and her destroyed social standing hit Jasmine with the force of a freight train. The perfectly curated facade she had maintained for her entire adult life simply dissolved. Massive theatrical tears began to pour down her face, ruining her expensive makeup and leaving dark streaks of mascara trailing down her cheeks. The flawless tailored cream Chanel suit suddenly looked completely absurd on her trembling, hysterical frame. She wailed loudly, a sharp, piercing sound of pure desperation. She tried to lunge forward to grab Connor's jacket, but he physically pushed her back, stumbling away from her and hiding behind the protective shoulders of his wealthy father. Jasmine realized in that exact terrifying moment that her husband was gone. Her marriage was over and her access to the country club elite was permanently revoked unless she could miraculously produce the immense wealth she had promised them. Driven by pure, unhinged narcissism, she turned her frantic, tear-streaked face away from her cowardly husband and locked her eyes directly on me. The profound sadness on her face instantly morphed into rabid, desperate entitlement. She stomped toward me, her designer heels clicking erratically against my imported hardwood floors. She pointed a shaking finger at my chest, her chest heaving with heavy, ragged breaths. "Maya, you have to fix this!" Jasmine screamed, her voice hoarse and commanding. "Tell them you are lying right now. Tell them Mom and Dad bought this house. Tell them this is our family coastal estate." The sheer, breathtaking delusion of her demand sent a ripple of fresh shockwaves through the 70 high society guests gathered in my living room. Sister Beatrice, the most prominent gossip from my parents' former church, was shaking her head in absolute disbelief, her hands clutched tight against her chest. David, my corporate attorney, actually let out a short, incredulous laugh from his position near the grand marble fireplace. I had spent his entire career dealing with entitled corporate thieves, but even he was stunned by the absolute audacity of my sister. "Give them the keys!" Maya Jasmine demanded, stomping her foot like a petulant toddler throwing a tantrum in a grocery store. "Just give Mom and Dad the keys to the master suite right now. Hand over the property deed. If you just give them this house, I can tell Connor parents that this was all a terrible misunderstanding. I can tell them my parents are wealthy property owners, and this is just our summer home. You owe me this, Maya. You already have a successful digital agency. You do not even need a house this big. I am going to lose my husband and my entire life if you do not give me this house today." I looked at my younger sister, who had literally never faced a single consequence in her 32 years of life. She had watched our parents drain their retirement and sell their home of 30 years just to buy her a fake rich lifestyle. She had watched them arrive at my property, covered in road dirt and sweat, expecting me to quietly surrender my hard-earned sanctuary so she could continue playing a wealthy socialite. And now, even after being exposed in front of the entire world, she honestly believed she could just scream at me and demand I hand over a $1.2 million estate to save her fraudulent marriage. I brought the silver microphone back to my lips. My posture remained perfectly straight, my emerald green silk dress radiating absolute, unshakable authority. I did not raise my voice. I did not need to. The quiet, deadly calm in my tone was far more terrifying than any scream could ever be. Jasmine, you are asking me to hand over a $1.2 million beachfront property that I purchased with my own savings and business earnings, just so you can sustain a fake marriage built on our parents' financial ruin. I stated clearly, ensuring the sound system carried every single syllable to the far corners of the room. You drained our parents completely dry. You let them make themselves homeless. And now, because your cowardly husband is throwing you away, you want to drink my blood too. Jasmine's face turned a violent shade of red. You have always been a selfish, hateful bitch, she shrieked, her voice breaking into an ugly, desperate sob. You planned this networking party just to embarrass me in front of Thomas and Victoria. You wanted to destroy my life because you are jealous that Connor chose me. I did not sell their house, Jasmine, I replied smoothly, staring directly into her panicked, tear-filled eyes. I did not force them to give you $800,000. I did not tell you to lie to your husband or his wealthy parents. You built a life in the dark using stolen money and fake prestige. I am simply refusing to let you use my home as your next hiding place. The answer is no. You will not get a single square foot of this property. Now get out of my house. The 70 guests remained perfectly silent, bearing witness to the undeniable truth of my rejection. The church elders who had always praised Jasmine as the perfect, beautiful, dutiful daughter were now looking at her with profound, severe judgment. The narrative had been permanently rewritten, and the golden child was finally experiencing the cold, harsh reality of boundaries. But a drowning family will pull anyone down with them to survive. Calvin had been standing in the center of the room, watching his golden daughter completely fall apart. He watched the white, wealthy family he worshipped reject his child with absolute disgust. He saw that his massive, ultimate sacrifice, selling his home and bankrupting his future, had been completely in vain. His legacy was destroyed, his pride was shattered, and the daughter he had treated like a scapegoat for 35 years was standing over them wrapped in silk and untouchable power. The humiliation completely snapped whatever rational thought Calvin had left in his brain. His eyes grew wild and bloodshot. His breathing became heavy and erratic. He realized that Jasmine was losing her marriage and her wealthy lifestyle right in front of him, and he simply could not accept the profound failure of his own parenting. Driven by pure, desperate delusion, he decided to make one final catastrophic gamble to save his shattered pride and steal my sanctuary. He reached his trembling, sweaty hand deep into the inner pocket of his dusty denim jacket. Calvin yanked his trembling hand out of the deep inner pocket of his dusty denim jacket. His thick fingers were wrapped tightly around a crumpled, heavily folded piece of white paper. He thrust his arm into the air, holding the document high above his head, like it was a winning lottery ticket. Maya did not buy this house, Calvin screamed, his voice cracking under the intense strain of his own lies. He pointed a thick, shaking finger directly at my face, his expression twisting into a mask of pure, unadulterated rage. She is a thief. I have the signed contract right here in my hand, proving she embezzled $500,000 from my business account to buy this property. This is my money. This is my house, and she stole it from us. Immediately, Valerie snapped back to life. The prospect of tearing me down and claiming the spotlight gave her a sudden, powerful surge of adrenaline. She pulled her smartphone out of her pocket and jabbed at the screen with dramatic, frantic energy. She pressed the phone to her ear and began pacing back and forth on the hardwood floor, speaking loudly enough for every single guest in the massive room to hear. "Yes, hello, I need police at this address immediately," Valerie cried out, injecting fake theatrical terror into her voice. "My daughter is a thief. She has stolen hundreds of thousands of dollars from our family business, and she is refusing to vacate our stolen property. We need officers right away before she tries to destroy the evidence." The room erupted into a fresh wave of shocked whispers. Sister Beatrice clutched her purse, her jaw dropping as she watched Valerie perform her desperate routine. Thomas and Victoria exchanged bewildered, angry glances, completely repulsed by the chaotic scene unfolding before them. Jasmine stood frozen, her tear-streaked face pale as she watched our parents launch their final desperate attack. I did not panic. I did not raise my voice or rush forward to defend myself against their wild accusations. I just stood there letting them dig their own graves as deep as they possibly could. I turned my head slightly and gestured toward the grand marble fireplace where my ultimate defense was waiting patiently. David stepped forward. He moved with the smooth, effortless grace of a man who destroyed predatory corporate executives for a living. He adjusted the cuffs of his immaculate tailored charcoal suit and walked directly into the center of the living room, placing himself squarely between me and my erratic father. His presence alone commanded the entire room, instantly neutralizing Calvin's aggressive posturing. "Good afternoon, everyone," David said, his deep, resonant voice cutting through the rising tension and demanding absolute respect. "My name is David, and I am the lead corporate counsel for Maya Digital Agency. I manage her entire financial portfolio and oversee all of her real estate acquisitions. Please allow me to clarify the absolute reality of this situation." David did not wait for Calvin to argue or interrupt. He turned to Kendra and gave a swift, decisive nod. The massive 85-inch smart television screen shifted instantly. The property deed vanished and was seamlessly replaced by a pristine chronological sequence of my official banking records and certified wire transfers. Every single guest in the room turned their attention to the glowing screen, completely captivated by the undeniable digital proof. David walked the audience through the documents with surgical precision. "As you can clearly see right here," he stated, pointing a laser pointer at the highlighted figures on the screen. "The total purchase price of this coastal estate was wired directly from Maya's personal holding account. That specific account was funded entirely by Maya's personal savings and documented earnings from her digital agency. The bank records and closing documents trace the purchase funds directly to her. There has never been a single transfer of funds between Maya accounts and any business entity owned by Calvin. My client has never received a single penny from her parents." Calvin lowered his arm, his face turning an unhealthy shade of purple. The crumpled paper in his fist suddenly looked incredibly pathetic, but he was too far gone to back down now. He had completely committed to his delusion, and backing out would mean facing the absolute devastation of his reality. "That is a lie," Calvin spat, taking a threatening step toward David. "I have the contract right here. She signed it last year. She took my money and I have the proof." David offered a cold, polite smile. It was the smile of a predator watching its prey walk willingly into a trap. He held out his open hand. "By all means," Sir David said smoothly. "Please allow me to examine this legally binding contract. If you have proof of embezzlement, I would be absolutely fascinated to read it right now." Calvin hesitated. He looked down at the crumpled paper, then looked up at David, confident, unwavering stance. Reluctantly, with shaking, sweaty fingers, Calvin handed the document over. He was banking on the hope that his sheer aggression would intimidate David into backing down. He was severely mistaken. David unfolded the paper, slowly smoothing out the deep creases with deliberate, mocking care. He adjusted his glasses and scanned the printed text. He did not look angry. He looked profoundly amused. Without saying a word, he handed the paper to Kendra, who instantly placed it under a high-resolution document scanner connected to the television system. Within seconds, Calvin's supposed legal contract was projected onto the massive screen for the entire room to read. David turned to face Thomas and Victoria, deliberately addressing Connor's wealthy parents to ensure they understood exactly who they were dealing with. "This is a very fascinating document," he announced, his voice dripping with professional sarcasm. "As you can see at the top of the page, this paper utilizes the official corporate letterhead of Calvin Contracting Business. He claims Maya embezzled $500,000 from this specific corporate account to fund her lifestyle." David paused, letting the tension build in the silent room. Valerie had stopped her frantic pacing, her phone still pressed to her ear, listening blindly as the dispatcher on the other end asked for more details. Calvin was sweating profusely, his eyes darting toward the front door, as if calculating whether he could simply turn and run. But David was not finished pulling the final threads of their deception. He turned his piercing gaze directly onto Connor, who was still cowering behind his wealthy parents. Calvin's bankruptcy records created an even bigger problem for the document in his hand. His contracting company had already been insolvent, and the preserved account statements showed that the business never held anything close to $500,000 at the time Maya supposedly took the money. Whatever that paper claimed, the underlying financial records directly contradicted it. The collective gasp from the 70 guests was deafening. Sister Beatrice let out a loud, dramatic wail of absolute shock, fanning herself aggressively with a program. Thomas' face turned a dangerous shade of crimson, realizing the sheer magnitude of the lies he had been fed by my family. Victoria placed a hand over her chest, her eyes wide with unadulterated horror. Jasmine collapsed onto the hardwood floor, weeping hysterically, as her carefully curated life of luxury shattered into a million irreparable pieces. Valerie dropped her phone, the device clattering against the imported wood, the dispatcher voice still echoing faintly from the small speaker. Calvin staggered backward, leaning heavily against a marble side table, completely defeated and exposed as a massive fraud in front of the very people he worshipped. I stood perfectly still, watching the glorious absolute destruction of the toxic empire they had built on my back. The heavy silence that followed David's revelation was abruptly pierced by the wail of approaching sirens. The sound cut through the warm coastal breeze, growing louder and more urgent with each passing second. Flashing red and blue lights began to reflect off the massive floor-to-ceiling glass windows of my living room, painting the horrified faces of my 70 guests in alternating shades of neon panic. Valerie had dialed 911 during her frantic pacing, completely convinced that law enforcement would serve as her personal eviction service. She had weaponized the police against me, hoping to have me dragged out of my own sanctuary in handcuffs. She honestly believed her tears and her age would instantly earn the officer's sympathy. Two uniformed police officers walked through the open front double doors, their heavy boots thudding against the imported Brazilian hardwood floors. They took one look around the massive room, instantly realizing they had not walked into a standard residential dispute. They were standing in the middle of a high society charity gala, surrounded by local politicians, business owners, and old money elites. The lead officer, a tall, stern-looking man with graying hair at his temples, placed his hand casually over his utility belt and scanned the crowd. He asked loudly, who had made the emergency call regarding a stolen property. Valerie practically shoved her way past Connor's wealthy parents to reach the officers. The absolute delusion running through my mother veins gave her a sudden burst of frantic energy. She pointed a trembling, manicured finger directly at me, her face twisted into a mask of theatrical distress. "Officers, thank God you are here," Valerie cried out, her voice shaking with fake tears. "That woman right there is my daughter. She embezzled $500,000 from our family business and used it to buy this house. We have the legal contract proving it. We came here today to reclaim our stolen property, and she is refusing to leave. She even hired these people to intimidate us." The lead officer looked at me, then looked at the crowd of impeccably dressed guests, sipping champagne. His eyes finally landed on Calvin, who was still leaning heavily against the marble side table, clutching the crumpled piece of paper. The officer walked calmly toward my father, asking to see the official contract Valerie had just mentioned. Calvin swallowed hard, his Adam apple bobbing visibly in his thick throat. He looked absolutely terrified. The aggressive patriarchal bravado he had displayed just 10 minutes ago had completely vanished. He was a man who had built his entire life on intimidation, but he knew he could not intimidate a police officer. His hand shook violently as he extended the crumpled paper forward. Before the officer could even finish reading the first paragraph, David stepped neatly into his line of sight. My attorney moved with the calm, calculated precision of a predator closing the final trap. "Officer, my name is David, and I am the corporate attorney representing the homeowner, Maya Lauren Brooks," David stated, handing the officer his sleek embossed business card. "The woman who just called you is Valerie, and the man holding that piece of paper is Calvin. They drove here today in a rented moving truck with the explicit intention of unlawfully occupying my client property. What you are holding appears to be a fabricated document being used to support a false claim of ownership, over my client's property. We have the underlying financial records available for review. The officer raised an eyebrow, looking between David's calm professional demeanor and Calvin's sweating panicked face. He asked David to clarify the situation and explain the discrepancies. David gestured to the 85-inch smart television screen, which was still projecting my pristine banking records and the official property deed. I have provided certified financial records, proving that my client purchased this estate entirely with her own savings and documented business earnings. David explained, his voice echoing clearly through the silent room. The document Calvin just handed you claims my client embezzled funds from his contracting business. The historical account statements show that Calvin's contracting business never held anything close to $500,000 at the time he claims Maya took the money. Those records directly contradict the document he just handed you, and we have preserved the underlying statements for review. The lead officer's expression hardened immediately. He looked down at the paper in his hands, studying the corporate letterhead Calvin had foolishly used to print his fake contract. The officer was not a financial expert, but he was smart enough to recognize a desperate scam when it was handed directly to him. He looked at the date on the forged contract, then looked at the glaring yellow highlighted dates on my projected bank statements. The math did not add up. The timeline was completely impossible. The entire document was a poorly constructed lie born of pure financial desperation. Thomas and Victoria watched the entire exchange with unabashed horror. Connor's wealthy parents were standing just a few feet away, witnessing my father being dismantled by a police officer and my attorney. Sister Beatrice and the church elders were completely silent, their mouths hanging open as they watched their respected church deacons sweating under police interrogation. Their whispered gossiping had ceased, replaced by a heavy, stunned silence. The lead officer handed the crumpled paper back to Calvin. He did not hand it back gently. He pressed it into Calvin's chest, forcing my father to take it. The officer's voice dropped an octave, carrying a sharp, unmistakable warning that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. "Sir," the officer said, "there are serious inconsistencies between this document and the financial records we have been shown. I am retaining the document as evidence while we determine exactly what happened here. Do not make any further attempt to enter, occupy, or claim this property." The officer's warning hit Calvin like a physical blow to the stomach. The remaining color drained completely from his face, leaving him looking like a sick, terrified old man. The absolute reality of his actions finally crashed through the thick walls of his narcissism. He was not going to get the master suite. He was not going to impress Thomas and Victoria. He was not going to live out his retirement by the ocean on my dime. He was now facing a serious criminal investigation. Calvin immediately started backpedaling. The aggressive, domineering father who had bruised my arm just minutes ago transformed into a pathetic, stammering coward. He held his hands up in surrender, his palms slick with sweat. He stumbled over his own feet as the gravity of his impending arrest settled over him. "No, officer, wait, you misunderstand," Calvin pleaded, his voice cracking pitifully. He took a stumbling step backward, creating distance between himself and the police. "This is just a family misunderstanding. That is all it is. Maya is my daughter. We were just playing a joke on her. It was a joke to teach her a lesson about respecting her elders. We never meant to actually steal anything. It is just a harmless prank between a father and his child." The sheer audacity of his lie was breathtaking. He had driven across state lines with a rented moving truck, carrying all his worldly possessions. He had physically grabbed me and threatened me. Valerie had called 911 and demanded I be arrested in front of my peers. And now, staring down the barrel of a felony fraud charge, he was trying to pass it off as a harmless family prank. He expected the police to just laugh it off and walk away. I stepped forward, my emerald green silk dress brushing against the imported hardwood floor. I looked directly into my father's terrified eyes, ensuring he saw absolutely zero mercy in mine. "It is not a joke, Calvin," I said, my voice ringing with absolute crystal-clear authority. "You sold your home to fund Jasmine's fraudulent lifestyle. You drove here today to hijack my sanctuary because you have nowhere else to live. You forged a legal document to steal my assets, and you brought the police here hoping they would do your dirty work. There is absolutely nothing funny about anything you have done today. Your arrogance has finally caught up with you." The guests remained perfectly silent, bearing witness to his ultimate destruction. Thomas turned away from Calvin in complete disgust, physically shielding his wife Victoria from having to look at my father for another second. The wealthy my parents had destroyed their lives to enter, were now officially closed to them forever. They were branded as criminals and frauds in front of the exact people they worshipped. Valerie watched her husband crumble into a stammering mess. She saw the police officer unclip his radio to call for backup. She looked at the massive screen displaying my undeniable wealth. She looked at Jasmine, who was still weeping hysterically on the floor, abandoned by her cowardly husband. And she looked at me standing tall and untouchable in the center of the room I owned. I held my head up high, completely victorious. The absolute realization that they had lost everything, their home, their money, their social standing, and their golden child marriage hit Valerie all at once. The illusion she had spent 35 years maintaining had just been vaporized into ash. And the daughter she had treated like garbage for decades was the one holding the match. Valerie let out a sound that I can only describe as a feral shriek. It was not a cry of sadness or a gasp of shock. It was the sound of a cornered predator realizing that every single exit had been permanently sealed. Her entire body began to shake with a violent, uncontrollable tremor. The thick layer of foundation on her face was completely ruined by sweat and tears, but she no longer cared about her appearance. She no longer cared about Sister Beatrice or the church elders watching her from the corner of the room. She no longer cared about Thomas and Victoria standing just feet away. The meticulously crafted mask of the graceful, affluent matriarch literally melted off her face, exposing the deeply toxic, desperate woman underneath. She realized in a flash of blinding clarity that she had zero money in her bank account. She realized she had no house to return to in Atlanta. She realized her husband was seconds away from being taken into custody over the document he had just handed to local police. And worst of all, she realized that I, the daughter she had treated like a disposable financial sponge for 3 decades, was the one standing over the ashes of her empire holding the match. Something inside my mother completely snapped. The sheer weight of her own catastrophic failures was too much for her fragile, narcissistic ego to bear. She needed someone to blame, and I was standing right in front of her, radiating the exact success and stability she had just thrown away. "I birthed you!" Valerie suddenly screamed, her voice scraping against the high vaulted ceilings of my living room with terrifying volume. "Your money is my money." She lunged at me. She did not just step forward, she threw her entire body weight into a frantic, uncoordinated sprint across my imported hardwood floors. Her arms were outstretched, her hands curled into claws aiming directly for the silver microphone in my right hand and the house keys I was holding in my left. She wanted to physically rip my power away from me. She wanted to tear me down to her level of absolute ruin. I did not even have time to brace myself for the impact before my defense wall activated. I did not need to move a single inch. Kendra, who had been standing near the catering tables anticipating exactly this kind of chaotic escalation, stepped directly into Valerie's path. My best friend threw her shoulder forward, bracing herself and completely blocking my mother line of attack. At the exact same moment, David stepped in from the other side, raising his arm in a firm defensive posture, shielding me completely from the chaotic incoming assault. Valerie slammed hard into David's forearm, her momentum abruptly halted. She flailed wildly, scratching and clawing at the air, trying to reach around my attorney to get to my face. She was completely unhinged, screaming incomprehensible threats and demanding I hand over my bank accounts. But her violent outburst lasted for exactly 3 seconds before the police intervened. The lead officer, who had just warned Calvin not to make any further claim to the property, did not hesitate. He moved with the swift, terrifying efficiency of a man trained to neutralize active threats. He grabbed Valerie by the shoulder of her mismatched, sweat-stained tracksuit, spinning her around with forceful authority. Valerie shrieked, thrashing her arms and trying to pull away from his grip, but the second officer immediately stepped in to secure her other arm. Stop resisting right now." The lead officer commanded, his voice cutting through her hysterical screaming. "You are under arrest for assault and trespassing." Valerie let out a blood-curdling gasp as the officer swiftly forced her arms behind her back. The sharp metallic click of the steel handcuffs locking around her wrists echoed loudly through the silent, horrified room. The sound was incredibly final. It was the sound of absolute, undeniable consequences. My mother, the woman who had spent my entire childhood demanding perfect obedience and pristine public behavior, was now standing in the middle of a high society charity gala bent over and restrained in police handcuffs. Calvin, who had been watching his wife unravel in frozen terror, suddenly snapped out of his trance. He took a frantic, stumbling step toward the officers, his hands raised defensively. "Wait, please, you cannot arrest my wife." Calvin begged, his voice cracking. "She is just upset. She is just emotional. Do not put those on her." The lead officer did not even blink. He handed Valerie off to his partner and turned his full attention back to my father. He unclipped a second pair of handcuffs from his duty belt. "Sir, place your hands behind your back," the officer ordered, his tone leaving absolutely zero room for negotiation. "Based on the document, the statements we have taken, and the reported physical confrontation, you are being placed under arrest while this matter is investigated." Calvin's eyes widened to an impossible size. The remaining color drained completely from his face, leaving him looking like a ghost. He slowly, mechanically raised his shaking hands and placed them behind his back. The second set of handcuffs clicked shut. My father, the man who had bruised my arm just 20 minutes ago, trying to intimidate me into surrendering my home, was now shackled and completely powerless. The officers immediately began reading them their rights. The clinical professional recitation of their right to remain silent formed a surreal soundtrack to the absolute destruction of my family legacy. Sister Beatrice and the church elders were clutching one another, their eyes wide with scandalous horror. They had just watched their respected deacon and his wife taken away in handcuffs in front of a crowd of 70 prominent community figures. The gossip mill in Atlanta would be fueled for the next decade. My parents' social standing was not just damaged, it was completely, permanently annihilated. That was when Jasmine finally broke. My younger sister, my parents' golden child, had been sitting on the hardwood floor weeping as her marriage dissolved. But seeing the cold steel handcuffs locked around our parents' wrists completely shattered whatever remaining grip she had on reality. She realized with terrifying clarity that there was no one left to bail her out. There was no one left to pay her bills, fund her designer wardrobe, or protect her from the consequences of her own lies. Jasmine scrambled forward on her hands and knees, her expensive tailored cream suit dragging across the floor. She dropped to her knees right at my feet, her mascara-stained face looking up at me with pure, desperate terror. "Maya, please," she begged, her voice a high-pitched, hysterical whine. "Maya, you have to stop this. Tell the police to let them go. Drop the charges, Maya, please. If they go to jail, I have nothing. I do not have a house. I do not have any money. You cannot do this to our family. You have to save us." I looked down at the sister, who had happily watched our parents bankrupt themselves to buy her a fake rich lifestyle. I looked at the woman who had called me a selfish, hateful person just 10 minutes ago for refusing to hand over my home. "The decision about prosecution is no longer mine, Jasmine," I said, my voice calm and detached. "Valerie just attacked David in front of 2 officers and dozens of witnesses. Calvin had already grabbed me, and the document they handed to police is now evidence. What happens next is up to the authorities. You built this trap all by yourselves." Before Jasmine could launch into another desperate plea, Thomas stepped forward. Connor, wealthy father, had been watching the police activity with undisguised, absolute disgust. He had watched the family he thought were wealthy coastal investors get exposed as desperate, fraudulent criminals. The sheer embarrassment of being associated with this chaotic spectacle was radiating off him in waves. He looked down at Jasmine, who was still kneeling on the floor, weeping hysterically. "You are a complete and utter disgrace," Thomas said, his voice cold enough to freeze the ocean outside my window. "You manipulated my son. You lied to my wife. You brought this filthy criminal spectacle into our lives, and you made us look like fools." "Connor, step away from that woman," Thomas barked, turning his severe gaze to his son. Connor, who had been standing near the fireplace looking completely shell-shocked, flinched at his father's command. He immediately took 3 large steps away from Jasmine, physically distancing himself from the wreckage of his marriage. Dad, I swear I did not know, Connor stammered, desperate to save his own position in the family hierarchy. I am going to file for divorce tomorrow. I promise. You will do exactly what I tell you to do, Thomas snapped, cutting his son off completely. But let me make one thing perfectly clear to both of you right now. Thomas looked directly at Connor, his expression absolutely merciless. You allowed this fraud to happen. You brought this garbage into my family because you were too lazy to build a real company and too arrogant to admit it was failing. As of this exact moment, your trust fund is officially suspended. Connor's jaw dropped, his eyes widening in pure horror. Dad, wait, please, you cannot do that. How am I supposed to live? You can figure it out like the rest of the working class, Thomas stated flatly, turning his back on his son. Your mother and I are officially cutting you off. You will not receive another dime of our money to fund your pathetic mistakes. Victoria stepped up beside her husband, refusing to even look at Jasmine kneeling on the floor. She adjusted her designer handbag and looked at me, offering a brief, respectful nod. The nod of a woman acknowledging another woman who knew exactly how to handle her business. I apologize for bringing our family drama into your beautiful home. Maya Victoria said, her tone polite, light, and remarkably composed despite the chaos. It is a stunning property. You have clearly earned every bit of your success. We will be taking our leave now. Thomas and Victoria turned and walked toward the front doors, their heads held high, completely abandoning their son and daughter-in-law in the center of my living room. They walked past Calvin and Valerie, who were now being firmly escorted toward the open front doors by the police officers. Jasmine let out a long, agonizing scream, realizing that her marriage, her wealthy lifestyle, and her entire future had just walked out the front door and gotten into a silver luxury car. She was left kneeling on the floor of my house, completely cut off, completely broke, and entirely alone. The police officers guided Calvin and Valerie through my massive front doors and out onto the crushed white marble driveway. The warm ocean breeze hit my mother directly in the face, but it did nothing to cool her absolute hysterical rage. She dug her designer sneakers into the gravel, refusing to walk quietly toward the waiting patrol cars. As the lead officer opened the back door of the police cruiser, Valerie twisted her body around to look back at me, standing victorious on the elevated front deck. You will pay for this, Maya, she screamed, her voice tearing through the beautiful coastal serenity. I will sue you for everything you own. I will take you to court for elder abuse. You cannot do this to your own mother. I will drag your name through the mud and completely destroy your business. I did not say a single word in response. I did not need to. David, my brilliant corporate attorney, walked calmly down the wooden steps of the deck, his polished leather shoes crunching softly against the white gravel. He approached the open door of the police cruiser, moving with absolute professional grace. He reached into his sleek leather briefcase and pulled out a thick, heavy manila folder. The police officer paused, holding Valerie firmly by the arm, allowing my attorney to conduct his final piece of business. David leaned down slightly, looking my mother directly in the panicked eyes. He casually slid the massive folder right onto her lap. This is a notice of judgment enforcement, Valerie, David stated, his voice perfectly even. Years ago, after Maya documented the identity theft, she obtained a civil judgment against you that was never fully satisfied. We are now moving to enforce the unpaid balance. I watched Valerie's face go completely blank. She stopped struggling against the police officer. She knew exactly what was inside that thick folder. When I was 22 years old, trying to rent my very first tiny apartment in the city, I was harshly denied. I ran a background check and discovered I had nearly $90,000 in defaulted credit card debt. My own mother had stolen my social security number. She had opened dozens of secret accounts in my name, maxing them out to buy designer bags, expensive vacations, and luxury items to maintain her fake wealthy lifestyle and fully fund Jasmine college experience. She had completely destroyed my financial future before my adult life even began. That massive, devastating theft was the exact reason I had to work grueling 80-hour weeks for 10 straight years. I had to claw my way out of the massive financial crater my own mother dug for me while simultaneously building my public relations career. I ate cheap ramen noodles and skipped meals while she wore clothes bought with my stolen credit. I had taken legal action years ago and eventually obtained a civil judgment against her, but much of what she owed remained unpaid because she kept almost nothing in her own name. Valerie stared down at the thick manila folder resting on her lap, as if it were a highly venomous snake. The enforcement packet documented the fraudulent accounts, the existing judgment, and the remaining balance she had never repaid. The officer gently pushed her head down and guided her into the back of the cruiser, slamming the door shut with a heavy metallic thud. Calvin was loaded into a separate squad car, his head hanging down in total defeat. The police vehicles rolled away, slowly crunching over the gravel and disappearing down the private coastal road, taking the last toxic remnants of my childhood with them. For several seconds after that, nobody moved. The quartet remained silent. A waiter stood near the kitchen holding a tray he had forgotten to set down. Even the ocean seemed louder now that the shouting was gone. Kendra reached me first. She took my arm gently, saw the marks Calvin had left, and asked if I wanted ice. That small question nearly broke through the composure I had maintained all afternoon. Not because the injury was serious, but because care without a price still felt unfamiliar. David joined us and quietly told me to photograph the bruising before it faded, save every camera recording, and write down the sequence of events while it was fresh. I followed his instructions, but my hands shook for the first time all day when I opened the notes application on my phone. The guests slowly began leaving. Some offered awkward apologies for having witnessed something so personal. Others simply squeezed my hand on the way out. Sister Beatrice hugged me longer than I expected, and for once did not have anything clever to say. After Kendra dismissed the catering staff, she and David stayed behind. We sat at the kitchen island, surrounded by untouched food and open windows. I admitted that part of me felt relieved, and another part felt sick. I had wanted my parents exposed. I had not wanted them to become the kind of people who would force police intervention. That night, after everyone left, I walked through the master suite my mother had demanded. For the first time since buying the house, I locked the bedroom door. Then I stood there with my hand on the key and realized I was not afraid they would come back. I was learning what safety felt like after spending most of my life preparing for the next demand. For once, the silence around me felt entirely mine. Back inside the living room, Jasmine finally stopped crying. The harsh realization that she was completely alone had settled over her like a heavy, suffocating blanket. She slowly picked herself up off the imported hardwood floor. Her expensive cream Chanel suit was deeply wrinkled and stained with spilled champagne. Her makeup was a tragic, ruined mess. I stood near the marble fireplace, simply watching her. She did not scream or demand the house keys anymore. She looked around the room at the 70 high society guests who were staring at her with cold, absolute judgment. At some point during the commotion, Connor had slipped out of the house and driven away without her. She had to pull out her smartphone and order a standard ride-share service to pick her up from my driveway. She walked out the front doors in total silence, dragging her heavy humiliation behind her. The guests watched her walk of shame, the golden child finally reduced to nothing. Fast forward 6 months into the future. The justice system and the universe have finally balanced the scales perfectly. Calvin and Valerie never got their luxurious coastal retirement. Instead, they are currently living in a cramped, moldy studio apartment on the most undesirable side of Atlanta. Calvin avoided a jail sentence after resolving the fraud-related case, but remained under 5 years of strict probation and court supervision. They are completely drowning in a massive mountain of legal fees and court-mandated fines. Enforcement of the unpaid identity theft judgment consumed much of whatever accessible money they still had left. Sister Beatrice and the church elders effectively pushed them out of the church community. Beatrice made sure the entire congregation knew exactly how Calvin and Valerie had tried to steal from their successful daughter. They are total social pariahs, unable to show their faces in the community they sacrificed absolutely everything to impress. They have nothing left but each other and the miserable reality of their own terrible choices. Jasmine experienced an equally spectacular downfall. The golden child finally had to face the real world without a financial safety net or a wealthy husband to protect her. Thomas and Victoria made good on their promise. They officially cut Connor off from the family trust fund, forcing him to face the angry startup investors on his own. Connor and Jasmine's marriage imploded immediately. They are currently navigating a highly toxic, messy divorce while drowning in massive corporate debt. Jasmine lost the luxury cars, the designer clothes, and the exclusive country club memberships. For the first time in her 32 years of life, she actually had to get a job. She is currently working a minimum wage retail position at a local shopping mall, folding shirts and dealing with angry, entitled customers. She has to wear a plastic name tag and clock in for early morning shift work. It is a harsh, crushing reality for a woman who used to pretend she was a self-made tech millionaire. She serves the exact social class she used to falsely claim she belonged to. The heavy, toxic weight of trying to earn my family conditional love is completely permanently gone. I am no longer the scapegoat. I am no longer the financial backup plan or the ugly duckling they can use for spare parts. I am simply Maya. It is a beautiful Tuesday evening. I am standing on the wraparound balcony of my $1.2 million coastal estate. The sun is beginning to set, painting the endless sky in breathtaking shades of deep violet and brilliant burnt orange. David and Kendra are sitting at the glass patio table behind me, laughing warmly about a recent corporate victory. They are my chosen family. They are the people who actually showed up for me when it mattered most. They protect my peace and celebrate my profound success without demanding a single piece of my soul in return. I bring a warm cup of herbal tea to my lips, taking a slow, comforting sip. I close my eyes and listen to the rhythmic, soothing sound of the ocean waves crashing against the pristine shore. My boutique digital agency is thriving. My home is safe. My heart is completely whole. The house feels incredibly light, completely cleansed of the dark energy my parents tried to drag through the front doors. I think back to the phone call that started this entire beautiful cascade of events. I reflect on my mother's sharp, entitled voice echoing through the speaker as she aggressively demanded the master suite of my hard-earned home. I remember the exact cold, arrogant threat she delivered when she honestly thought she held all the power in the world. If you do not like it, you can find somewhere else to live. I open my eyes and look out at the vast, endless ocean. A gentle, warm breeze sweeps across the balcony, rustling the green leaves of the potted palm trees, swaying gracefully in the fading light. I smile into the ocean breeze, taking a deep, cleansing breath of the salty coastal air. She was right. I did find somewhere else. I found my peace. The biggest lesson from Maya's story is that love without boundaries can easily become exploitation. Family relationships are supposed to be built on care, respect, and mutual responsibility. But being related to someone does not give them unlimited access to your time, money, home, or future. Maya spent years believing that keeping the peace meant staying quiet, answering every call, and tolerating behavior that constantly crossed her boundaries. Her parents used guilt, childhood sacrifices, and the idea of family duty to convince her that everything she earned somehow belonged to them. The moment Maya finally stopped accepting that belief, the entire power dynamic changed. Another important lesson is that independence is not only about earning money. Maya had already built a successful career, created her own company, and purchased a beautiful home. Yet emotionally, she still carried the pressure of wanting her parents' approval. Financial success had protected her lifestyle, but it had not completely erased the old fear of disappointing them. Her real freedom began when she understood that she did not need their permission to protect what she had built. Sometimes the hardest form of independence is accepting that certain people may never approve of your choices, no matter how reasonable those choices are. The story also shows why preparation is more powerful than impulsive revenge. Maya did not respond to her mother's threat by screaming, insulting her family, or making reckless decisions. She documented her ownership, contacted her attorney, protected her property, and made sure the truth could be proven. When her parents eventually tried to rewrite reality, Maya did not have to rely on emotion. She had records, witnesses, and clear boundaries. The strongest response to manipulation is often not a louder argument but evidence and preparation. There is also a warning about sacrificing your own stability to maintain appearances. Calvin and Valerie destroyed their financial security because they cared more about impressing Thomas and Victoria than protecting their retirement. Jasmine built her identity around designer clothes, wealth, and social status, instead of creating something sustainable for herself. Connor depended on family money, instead of accepting that his business was failing. Every one of them chose appearance over reality, and eventually reality became impossible to hide. Finally, Maya's victory was not truly the public humiliation of her family, or watching them face consequences. Her real victory came later, when she could stand inside her own home without waiting for the next demand. She learned that peace does not come from finally proving toxic people wrong. It comes from deciding that they no longer have the power to determine your worth, control your decisions, or disturb the life you worked so hard to build. Sometimes protecting your peace will disappoint people who benefited from your lack of boundaries. That does not mean the boundary is wrong. It may simply mean it was long overdue. If this story reminded you that protecting your peace is never selfish, please